Hello and welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss the second part of postmodernism. The main objectives of today's lecture are: 1. To explain the connection between modernism and postmodernism. 2. To discuss the primacy of fiction in postmodernism and its features. 3. To explain the novelist's engagement with history within postmodernist fiction. 4. To study the impact of postmodernism on poetry. 5. To study postmodern drama and theatre. The connection between modernism and postmodernism is not easy to explain because of the manner in which the two have been theorized by thinkers and critics in divergent ways. For example, Jameson says that postmodernism is a reaction to what was in modernism, and because there were many modernisms, there are many postmodernisms. This implicitly suggests that the two are oppositional. Lyotard's formulation that postmodernism is anti-foundational and rejects grand narratives too sounds like the two isms are different from each other. Linda Hutchins seems more realistic and reasonable when she says that there are many points of convergence between the two and contends the views of Jameson and Eagleton. In fact, the manner in which she sees the connection between the two deserves attention. And I quote, "The modern is ineluctably embedded in the postmodern, but the relationship is a complex one of consequence, difference, and dependence." When Jameson develops his concept of schizophrenia to suggest that in postmodernism, and I quote, "historicism and historical depth, which used to be called historical consciousness or the sense of the past, are abolished," Hutchins' response is that the past as referent is not bracketed or effaced as Jameson would believe, but incorporated and modified, given new different life and meaning. Similarly, postmodernism is not against order. In fact, it acknowledges the urge to order, as Hutchins says, but draws attention to the fact that the orders we create are human constructs and neither natural nor given. The same is true of modernism's preoccupation with unity and certainty. Postmodernism creates room for accommodating the provisional and critical. In other words, postmodernism interrogates everything with which modernism is associated, and thus becomes the critical voice that modernism once was. Another interesting aspect to this is that the modifications that postmodernism makes in what is modernism, which creates differences between the two, also varies between different spheres of knowledge. For example, in the field of architecture, architects used advances in industrial technology to create what became an international style of architecture, a modernistic architecture, which in its drive to create similar-looking landscapes broke up the old order of traditional communities. The postmodern response to this is to accept all the advances made in the field during modernism, but to modify existing spaces and styles to accommodate the needs of people craving for distinctive identities and respect for their traditions, for which the architects borrowed styles from different periods of the past to create styles suited to the changed times. In other words, the spirit of modernism is given a new shape and direction and not totally rejected. In spheres where there was no international standard, which includes all other fields of artistic activity, the connection between modernism and postmodernism admits of variations. In art, the modernists created several new kinds of styles to oppose the existing ones. These include the ones associated with Dadaists, Surrealists, and Futurists. All these are actually reactions to representation in which the earlier ones stressed realistic effects. The modernists worked on moving away from representation to abstraction. Instead of creating art that tried to hide artistry and create a natural effect, the modernists worked towards drawing attention to the artistry of their creations. And in this, they chose to set themselves apart from commercial art. For many others, like André Breton, the purpose of art was also to administer shock so that people could be provoked into thinking and questioning what they saw. The purpose behind this was that art could be used for changing things. Postmodernism absorbs several things from this, but also makes changes. For example, it moves away from abstraction to accommodate multiple ways of artistic creations, including the classes that had been left out because of the exclusivity of the modernists. This, for example, is seen in the absorption of pop art into the modernist fold of serious art. Postmodernism also retains the spirit of questioning and extends it to areas that do not figure prominently in modernism. For example, female artists made inroads into the art establishment that had been dominated by men. The discussion on postmodernism in literature will also include a discussion on its relationship with the two isms. Discussions of literature within the postmodern have almost entirely dealt with fiction, as is clear from the work of Hutcheon, A Poetics of Postmodernism, or Brian McHale's Postmodernist Fiction, and Brenda Marshall's Teaching the Postmodern, Fiction and Theory. Stephen O'Connor goes to the extent of saying that, and I quote, "The move from modernism to postmodernism involves a move from poetry to fiction." Elaborating it further, he says that if modernism means the assumption that literature approaches to the condition of poetry, postmodernism means the tendency to assume that literature is intrinsically narrative. The nature and range of postmodernist fiction is truly global and includes novelists from America, England, Europe, and Latin America and Italy. The discussion that follows attempts to present some key ideas related to this from multiple sources. Both modernist and postmodernist fictions are highly innovative and experimental, which pertain mostly to narrative strategies. But in this, there is an essential difference between them. Though the choppy and discontinuous narratives of the modernist kind make exacting demands on their readers, they lend themselves to unity because they are grounded in the shared knowledge between writers and readers that all artistic works are rooted in cohesion and meaning. But it is different in the postmodern variety. The pervasive element of disruption in narratives of this kind is not of mere formal complexity. Rather, it is meant to emphasize what Patricia Waugh calls the recognition that we live in a world constituted through multiple kinds of discourses or language games that contradict and contest each other even as they complement and are constructed out of each other. Modernists were primarily formalists and stressed the importance of the principle of structure or form based on what Connor calls the principle of scenography. That is, the manner in which parts of the whole are put together, in which perspective and voice acquire importance. This tendency actually led to the development of a new poetics of the form, which stimulated critical activity and impacted the academy, resulting in the publication of critical works on the theory of fiction, explaining the techniques used by writers to create properly structured works. The prominence given to narrative in modernism stimulated interest in the theory of narratology, helped by the rise of structuralism. but the effort resulted in only describing recurrent structures or patterns based on the study of narrative tradition that went back to the past. It did not touch upon the possibilities created by shifts and movements, and this, as Stephen Connor states, changed in the 1990s and is brought out in Andrew Gibson's Towards a Postmodern Theory of Narrative, which goes beyond the abstract form of the narrative to indicate how it overshoots its limits, disrupting its mode of linearity and yielding a conception of time as irregular and random. This renewed interest in narrative is seen by postmodernist critics as symptomatic of a shift that McHale describes as one from modernist fiction's concern with epistemological issues to postmodernist fiction's concern with ontological issues. That is, modernists are more concerned with fiction as a source of knowledge and understanding, while postmodernists are concerned with the creation of different worlds and their interrelationships. However, these are not divergent categories. The making of the new worlds helps in sharpening knowledge and understanding that the modernists emphasized. Apart from this, postmodern novelists carry further another striking tendency of the modernist fiction, that of drawing attention to the artifice of writing by constantly alerting the reader to its fictionality. Metafiction thus becomes the most dominant form of postmodern novels, like those of John Fowles and Kurt Vonnegut. Linked with this is also the novelist's extreme self-consciousness of the complex nature of narrative as a mechanism to impose order on his materials, and also the related fact of what Waugh calls being constituted through the conventions of the narrative. The domination of these tendencies also accounts for the prominence of what Matti Kalanesko calls narrative perspectivism in many postmodern novels, which is radically different from the psychologically oriented perspectivism of modernism seen in its complex form in William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. As against this, the novels of Fowles and Umberto Eco are characterized by duplication and multiplication of beginnings, ending, and narrated actions. These novels also revel in what Kalanesko calls the parodic thematization of the author, which is distinguishable from the intrusive or manipulative author of the earlier kind. The democratic strain in postmodernism, which contrasts with the elitist character of high modernism, leads to another interesting feature of postmodernist fiction. It is reflected in the collapse of forms in which generic boundaries and conventionally determined categories are dissolved to create room for eclectic and freer forms. The discontent towards earlier forms also leads to a shift in thinking on knowledge that, in the words of Seidman, contests disciplinary boundaries, the separation of science, literature, ideology, and the division between knowledge and power. The result is a considerable increase in the novelist's freedom to make the most of their inventive energies with far-reaching consequences for their fictional style. The novels of Eco, for example, are a delightful mix of narrative ingenuity, philosophical thinking, playful exuberance, heavy scholarship, and the popular forms of romance, mystery, and detection. Unlike the modernist novels, they are also highly readable, and yet they are also complex and subtle, compel reflection, and provoke thinking. This makes them layered texts with multiple codings, which also provides for their varied readings. Another feature wherein postmodernism departs from modernism is the writer's engagement with history. Though some Marxist thinkers like Jameson have said that there is no possibility of history and historical consciousness within postmodernism, many literary critics believe that it is unfair to club postmodernism with ahistorical modernism. Hutcheon considers the presence of the past a significant feature of postmodernism and associates it largely with the novel genre, which she calls historiographic metafiction. This includes, and I quote, those well-known novels which are both intensely self-reflexive and yet paradoxically also lay claim to historical events and personages and include, among others, French Lieutenant's Woman, Midnight's Children, Ragtime, and famous Last Words. The engagement of the novelists with history is quite understandable when we remember that postmodernism distrusts big narratives and prioritizes the local, the particular, the specific, as opposed to the universal, the general, and the total. Because of this, writers have shown interest in varieties of submerged voices of women, of minorities, depressed classes, and marginalized communities. This has resulted in a significant historiographic intervention through fiction, which is different in character and spirit from the earlier 18th and 19th century Western novelists' response to the historiographic moment of their times. In fact, it also opens space for feminist fiction and also post-colonial fiction. So it is quite understandable why Hutcheon considers this intervention of the novelist a key feature of postmodernism and dwells on some of its distinguishing features in several chapters of her book on postmodernist fiction. And these are: 1. Hutcheon views historiographic metafiction as a response to what she calls the hermetic ahistoric formalism and aestheticism that characterized much of the art and theory of the modernist period. Because of this, she refutes Jameson's estimate of Dr. Rao's Ragtime and states that the historical referent in it is not absent but present in ample measure. 2. A good deal of self-consciousness characterizes the efforts of the novelists when they deal with history. They draw their attention to the manner in which history gets written so that reader gets a clear idea about the processes in which it comes to life and in which it's very close to fiction. In her own words, historiographic metafiction refutes the natural or common sense methods of distinguishing between historical fact and fiction. It refuses the view that only history has a truth claim, both by questioning the ground of that claim in historiography and by asserting that both history and fiction are discourses, human constructs, signifying systems, and both derive their major claim to truth from that identity. 3. Hutcheon distinguishes historiographic metafiction from the older variety of historical novel in terms of the manner in which historical events and actual historical figures are treated in them and for varied ends. She also shows how it is different from another variety of non-fictional novel, also known as the New Journalism novel, which she regards as a late modernist creation. Though some novels of this kind, like Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night, come very close to historiographic metafiction. And 4. Historiographic metafiction also raises issues regarding the interaction of historiography and fiction that have a significant place in the poetics of postmodernism. These include issues regarding the nature of identity and subjectivity, the question of reference and representation, the intertextual nature of the past, and the ideological implications of writing about history. These fictions, in short, not only provide new insight into the past that it deals with, but also alert the reader to the very process of history writing, as for example Rushdie does in Midnight Children, in which readers get to know about India's pre- and post-independent pasts and their connection and its implications, as well as the manner in which Salim Sinai uncovers the process of writing it out. Because of the primacy of the novelistic narrative in postmodern literature, poetry and drama have rather a low presence in it. Poetry is characterized by high experimentation in which poets build connections with music, painting and performances and let the words take on the shape of graphic designs. Michael McClure writes in the style of the Beat generation, which established the connection of poems with jazz beats. The connection of poetry with the artistic work of established painters is particularly noticeable in a group of poets who are associated with the New York School of Poets. Lawrence Ferlinghetti has a strong connection with jazz and the paintings of Goya and considers poems as spontaneous oral messages. John Ashbery identifies himself with the crisis and aspirations of modern painters and creates poems that have both a verbal and visual appeal. Kenneth Koch writes a poem called The Artist, and Frank O'Hara responds to the work of the artists in his poem Why I Am Not a Painter. In their experiments with language, the poets disrupt accepted modes of written syntax and play with grammar, and thus emphasize that language is only a means of constructing poems and not necessarily a means of representing human consciousness. Another variety of poems is labeled ethnopoetics, which takes elements from the poetic tradition of non-European countries and is associated with Jerome Rothenberg. Largely because of their extreme experimentation, these poems were published by little magazines and small presses. The former include Language, Talks, Poetics Journal, and others. Although the poets who wrote for them and got published through these presses did not express their open connection with postmodernism, their poetic practice and their theorization of the craft reflected some notable tendencies of postmodernist thinking. Because of their extreme experimentation, they have been castigated by Marxist critics like Jameson, who says, and I quote, that the language poets have, in many ways, made the experience of temporal spontaneity, the experience described in terms of schizophrenic language, central to their language experiments and to what they like to call the new sentence. Not content with creating poems, the language poets also came out with credos and manifestos which offer explanations for their experimentations, in which they interrogate the communicative transparency of the language, the poetics of presence, and think of poets as a community with shared practices rather than as individuals. Similar groups established their presence in England too, with centres in London and Cambridge, and include a whole host of names like Robert Shepard, Dennis Riley, and many more. All of them share the beliefs and practices of the poets that flourished in America. Several universities discuss their work, and as Tim Woods remarks, most poets writing around this time possess a sense of subjectivity constructed through language usually, but not always, as a result of a conscious, unapologetic and unashamed engagement with recent developments in a literary and cultural theory. Postmodern drama and theatre too occupy a small space in postmodern literature. Some critics tend to see the later phase of established playwrights like those of Beckett as postmodernist because of his refusal to accept modernist potency in art. Connor, for example, comments on the mix of the modernist and postmodernist in Beckett. While the austerity of his style matches the modernist impulse, his other preoccupations, including the nature of his writing, is postmodernist in spirit. In his own words, Beckett's art of retraction always seems countermanded by the drive to resumption, repetition and reproduction. Rather than simply disappearing from view, Beckett's work disappears into itself, endlessly recycling characters, ideas and word fragments. Postmodern theatre failed to make it big because of the rise and popularity of several visual mediums like films and television, and also because writers could not meet the requirements of the medium. Peter Handicake's play Offending the Audience revolves around 4 characters who make long speeches that they are not going to act, they will not have any scenery, nor representation, and thus no theatre. Many others use texts only to present situations for stimulating questioning. Some, like Richard Foreman, frustrates the expectations of the audience through what Wood calls disruption of closure through systematic distortions and constantly frustrating continuities and coherence. 2 others who disrupt formal boundaries of theatrical representation are Michael Kirby and Robert Wilson. It is appropriate to end this lecture with a question. Is postmodernism over? Josh Stott, the author of the book called The Passing of Postmodernism, thinks that it is. He invokes Linda Hutcheon, who has admitted that postmodernism has passed. Stott's book argues that there has been a shift in contemporary narrative from historiographic metafiction to neo-realism. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Till then, take very good care of yourself. Thank you for watching.